Welcome to tonight's panel. I'm Nancy Lamaya, and Jean Muntz and I are going to be facilitating the session tonight. This is the fourth and final session of Under Our Feet, and this is our third annual Start in Your Yard Winter Series, sponsored, as Sadia mentioned, by Wild Ones Gail Borden and the Sustainability Commission. We hope you've been able to attend all three sessions so far. But if you've missed any, you can watch the videos on our website, startinyouryard.com. They're on the front page and on the community read page. So before getting started with the panel, we want to make sure you know that our Wild Ones native plant sale is May 18th. Today's the 18th, May 13th, at Gray Willows Farm in Campton Township, from 9 to 2. We'll have plants from 6 trusted growers, and the long list of plants we expect to have available is on startinyouryard.com and will be on our other website and Facebook pages. Also, this spring, our Wild Ones members are leading pop-up walks each weekend to see the lovely blooming ephemeral plants that inhabit our forest preserves. All the pop-up walks are posted on our websites and Facebook pages. And the next one's coming up Sunday, the 23rd at 1:30 at Bliss Woods. And I just want to make sure you have on your list April 30th, which will be a walk at Trout Park, led by the steward, Sue Bone. It's a small preserve, but one with very special features. It is a treasure. And finally, we've been getting together on Zoom for Start in Your Yard roundtable discussions on Monday nights this past month. We talk about what's on people's minds, and we're particularly receptive to questions about how to get started with planting native plants, what people recommend based on their own experience. So go to startinyouryard.com, click the green roundtable button at 7 o'clock Monday night to join in. No registration necessary. So tonight, our panelists will be talking about the implications of what we've learned from our soil experts in Under Our Feet. What do we need to be doing on our land? How do we translate what we've learned into what we actually do as we care for the land we live on? So here's Jean to introduce our panelists.
Hi, everyone. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed panelists. First of all, Gary Swick. He's been an educator in District 300 for 34 years, where under his direction, students have planted over 50,000 trees and restored acres of natural areas. His 30 years with Friends of the Fox has contributed to creating a watershed of caretakers whose ongoing mission is to continue to fix the fox. We think he's suited to talk about gardening on our panel today, in part because he says he's living in his 5th home with the 5th yard converted to a wildlife habitat. And next we have Corey Begalka, Start in Your Yard's favorite invasive plant patrol officer and enforcer. With a background in biological sciences and zoology, Corey is a certified Kane County naturalist and listed as one of our Start in Your Yard resources to assist homeowners in identifying, dealing with, and removing invasive plants, trees, shrubs, to begin making room for more native species. And Stacy Zuber. Dr. Zuber is the soil health specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for the state of Illinois, based in the Champaign, Illinois office. I hope I got that right. She says her goal in this position is to encourage the adoption of soil health management systems across all land uses, from small home gardens to agricultural cropland. Stacy grew up on a family farm in Southeast Illinois. Please read more about each of our presenters on our startinyouryard.com website. And now, let the fun begin.
Well, our goal with this panel is to deepen our understanding of how we can implement the 4 basic principles of soil health that Mark Bramstead and Emma Levins talked about in their presentations. So Stacy, would you start us off by reminding us briefly of the 4 principles that will guide today's discussion, and we hope will eventually come to guide the way we treat our land?
Sure, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone is able to see that. So when we're talking about soil health principles, we have 4 main principles, ideas that we're focused on to build soil health and to kind of make that soil be more productive, be more sustainable. So most of the aspects of this that we're looking at can be applied whether you're talking about large crop fields or the small garden. So what we're talking about with this are things like minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover. So those are going to be these over here on this side. So we're minimizing disturbance, and minimizing disturbance is not just reducing tillage. That is one of the main things of it. We're wanting to reduce soil disturbance. We do not want to be disturbing that soil very much. We want to minimize that as much as possible, but it also can include things like chemical disturbance. So any application of chemicals to the surface is going to be a disturbing practice as well. So we want to minimize that. Not necessarily always eliminating it entirely, but we want to get as little as possible. As in soil cover is really just about protecting that soil surface. So we're protecting it from raindrops that are hitting it so that we're not having erosion, we're not having runoff from that. And both of those principles kind of in here are really about protecting that soil, protecting the soil organic matter. And I'll talk more about aggregates, I think, later in this panel, but that's another aspect of this that we're really focused on protecting. The other side of the soil health principles is all about the living things that we're growing in it. So maximizing the continuous living roots. As much of the year as possible, we want living, growing things in that soil because they are feeding the biology within the soil. They are providing sugars and proteins that feed all of the different organisms from small to large that are living in that soil, and we want to feed them as much of the year as possible. And then the other component of that is really maximizing biodiversity. So we want as many different organisms in that soil and on that growing in that soil as possible. So in a cropland situation, maybe that includes integrating livestock in your backyards, maybe chickens, something like that. But even without that, we want to make sure we're getting as many different plant species in there as possible, maximizing that. And so with things like native plantings, that allows you to put a lot more different species out there as possible. If you don't have that, if you're doing it in a home garden, it's kind of rotating that and moving and putting as many different types of plants and different types of species out there as possible, because that's really, again, about feeding the biology that are in here, the different organisms. So you want to give them as much food as possible and as much diversity in that food. So as many different things as they can get. So that's really kind of our 4 main principles in here, is that all about protecting and feeding the organisms within the soil.
Thanks very much. Remembering just these 4 ideas gives us a framework for making decisions about what to do in our own gardens. So now, Corey, as a person who does a great deal of work with invasive plants, would you speak to this issue that we often have to address in getting started with native plants? What about the plants that are already occupying the land? How do we decide what to keep, what to get rid of? What do we do?
Well, first you have to identify what you have, because some of the plants have certain properties that affect the soil. Some might be native that are good, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So you either get really good at identifying plants, or you get some help, and that's what we'll do with at the wild ones, we will help you identify what you have. And then we'll make a plan on what to keep and what to get rid of. But the highly invasive plants, we want to get rid of right away. So we can start preparing the soil, because as Paul Stamets said, soil is ecological currency and we need to take care of it.
Well, could you give us a starting point by listing 5 or 6 of the most common, the most noxious things that we need to address right up front?
Yeah, probably in the garden is different than in the woodland. In the garden, you're gonna probably see things like Canada thistle, which is highly invasive. Creeping Charlie, everybody knows Creeping Charlie, which is pretty much naturalized. One of the big ones that I really can't stand is garlic mustard. And garlic mustard and Canada thistle are both have a chemical property that's called allelopathic, and that means it puts chemicals into the soil which inhibits the growth of other plants or germination of other plants. And then there's mock strawberry too, which is a new one that's really spreading around. It's like a walker. So I
Yes.
think, and dandelions. And dandelions is one of those ones where pollinators will use it just like they will Creeping Charlie too. So it might not be bad just to leave them in sometimes.
Well, and you might also address some of the ones from the restorations, because some of those are coming from our yards, and some of us, like me, are buying our properties because they have things like the big B hedges. So you might want to mention those to these guys too.
The sedges?
Hedges, buckthorn hedges.
Oh,
Or-
yeah, that's what I consider more woodland stuff. But yeah, the buckthorns are some of the worst, because birds eat them and spread them when they should be eating native berries that are full of the healthy benefits. Buckthorn is not good for them. It's not good for the soil. It's allelopathic as well. Same with honeysuckle. The honeysuckles, they were kind of brought over here for their beauty and for erosion control. And in the end, we find out that they're really causing more erosion than they're preventing. And also the buckthorn, I wanted to go back to real quick, it's off the top of my head. They increase the nitrogen in the soil too. The leaves are high in nitrogen, same as the autumn olive. Autumn olive is also highly invasive, and it's a nitrogen fixer in the soil. And that changes the chemistry of the soil where it shouldn't be changed. So those are some of the big ones.
And what do people do if they have a buckthorn hedge like I did? What do you do about that?
Burn it. No, I'm kidding. No, those are something that you want to remove right away, and remove the sticks and take them away, because even laying down the decaying sticks will put those chemicals into the soil. And once again, we want to take care of that soil. And it depends on how big the buckthorn is. If it's little twigs, less than an inch wide, you can chop them off down at the base. And what I do is I put triclopyr on the bloody stumps. And triclopyr, all it is a hormone mimicker, which confuses the roots into growing itself to death. So it's not like a poison that's going to affect everything.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, as soon as we start talking about weeds or invasives, the question of using chemicals arises, and that steers our discussion toward where those chemicals run off to, toward the watershed. Gary, you're very involved with our river and the streams, our watershed here in the Fox Valley. Would you talk about rainwater as an asset, why we should keep it on our land, and how we can go about doing that?
Yes. So do you want me to talk about chemicals or rainwater?
The interrelationship and how to keep the water.
Okay. So one thing about chemicals is it's one of the many things that we create in our culture that have unintended consequences. So we apply something to do one thing, and it maybe does many, many more things that we later regret. And you can see it when I'm dealing with litter, like people now are trying to eliminate plastic bags and polystyrene through legislation to be part of our culture to prevent it from being litter. And, you know, it had a function, but the litter thing is outweighing it. And so I would ask people to please evaluate what it is that they need before they apply any chemicals, and then consider alternatives, and at a bare minimum, read the instructions. So on the instructions, pretty much no matter what it is, it asks you not to apply it when it's windy and not to apply it before there's going to be precipitation, because all those will have the potential to carry those chemicals off the site where you intend to work on those. And yes, you own your property, but you don't own the air over your neighbor's property or where the water is going to run off. And so a huge problem for water quality is people doing things on their land, but then it runs off their land onto the sidewalk, into the street, into the storm drain, where it's carried into a waterway. And it is significant. And it's not just the chemicals that we're applying as fertilizer, herbicide, insecticides, fungicides, but even things like leaves. Like, nature has a balance, and people dump leaves, some in forest preserves, they dump them in the street, and those are still full of nutrients, and they upset the balance in waterways. I always say that nature knows best, and we should, you know, nature's been operating for billions of years. We've only been having yards for 70 years, really. We are infants. And if we could just try to appreciate how nature manages everything and use that as our guide, rather than thinking we're far smarter with our 70 years of experience, which I don't mean to discount people, but we don't pay attention well. We listen to what other people tell us we should be doing, whether it's a tree care mailer that comes or a commercial that tells you what you should put on your yard at this time. Sorry, I'm going off a little. But how nature works is water is held where it lands generally. It infiltrates into the soil. But we have abused the soil so badly that oftentimes it's so compacted, it just runs right off. So like rain barrels are very popular, but rain barrels fill up in one heavy rainstorm, and rain barrels maybe have to me, have a value in a water reservoir when you're in a drought condition and you need to run it. It's not the place to store water. That it should be allowed to infiltrate down into the ground. And so we want to manage, I encourage people to manage with deep-rooted vegetation. And if you have a place where water runs off, try to keep it there and use plantings there, or a little topography. Like, water should be our friend. We don't want it in our basement. And that's why we have gutters and downspouts, but it's a vital use and really a wasted resource. And if I may, I want to give a big thank you to this whole series for caring about soil. We work really hard in protecting air quality and protecting water quality. And soil is just the unseen, abstract, not understood, and probably the most disrespected of all our resources. It's not dirt, it's soil, and it has great value. And out of water and air, it has the least opportunity to restore itself. It takes a long time. Rivers are very dynamic and air mixes all the time, but it takes a long time for all those microorganisms and nutrient cycles to do their job. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. And you provide a perfect segue to Stacy, because you talked about one of the critical factors in the rain running off is that our soil is so compacted. And so I want to throw the ball now to Stacy to talk about how we compact the soil, how to prevent it, and how to come back from it. So if you'd talk about what did you call it? Soil. Tell me the term again for
Soil aggregation.
Yeah.
Yes. So
stability.
yeah, soil aggregate stability is kind of one of the key characteristics, one of the key things about soil that really can make a healthy soil. So a lot of that comes back to, and things that both Mark and Emma talked about in their presentations, having to do with the pore space within soils. So a compacted soil has much less pore space, which means there's not room for air or water to move into the soil, which can cause, obviously, if there's no room for the water to come in when you have those rainfall events, it can't infiltrate, it can't soak into the soil, it runs off the surface. It also doesn't allow air in there, which can cause problems for your microbial community, all those organisms that we need living in the soil, because they're really responsible for a lot of the benefits that we can get from the soil, things like nutrient cycling, things like plant protection. All of those are really key. To get those, we need an environment that's kind of a good habitat for all of those different organisms. So how this works, it all goes back to the soil health principles. We want to build up soil aggregates, and I'm actually going to share my screen because I have a good image of this for you. We want the good aggregates. We want a soil that looks like this on the left, rather than what we have on the right over here. This is not a well aggregated soil. There's not open pore spaces in that soil. So when we look at this kind of just in a diagram here, that's the big difference here. Is this has open pore spaces that allows that water to move in, rather than sealing off the soil surface, not allowing the water to move in. There's not allowing airflow to come in here either. So one of the things with this, when we're talking about aggregates and what they are, we need to know that they are basically just chunks of soil kind of that are glued together. The individual sand, silt, and clay particles of the soil, the minerals that are in the soil, are all glued together into these larger chunks that we call aggregates. And that we have those in these pictures here. But the thing that's gluing these all together, the micro aggregates and a bunch of the micro aggregates glued together in these larger macro aggregates, is basically organic matter. And a lot of that organic matter, or almost all of it, and is coming from byproducts of microbial activity that they are giving off. They give off these sticky substances, microbial glues, that are holding those together. So it's things like proteins that are on there. It's things like actual filaments and hyphae and things from the fungi. All of those are actually holding those individual particles together. So all of this comes back to, you have to create an environment that brings those organisms to the table, to the soil. We need to feed them with those continuous living roots, with that biodiversity. And then they will start building these aggregates for us. And that makes the soil much more resilient. It makes it better able to withstand any forces that go on it. Obviously, we don't, one of the best ways to avoid compaction is not putting any kind of weight or force on really wet soils, because they will compact if you have those. But if you were able to kind of follow these soil health principles and build up the soil microbial community, that they can build these aggregates, that can really help make those soils able to withstand the forces better, because also they're allowing that water to move in. They're not sitting on the surface, and you don't have just this muddy couple inches on your surface if you have these aggregates in place. But the key thing with this is, even if you have that microbial community, that you got there who can build those aggregates. Anytime you do any kind of soil disturbing practices, so any kind of tillage, whether it's a rototiller or, you know, even if you get out there and use a hoe on the soil to dig up the weeds and things like that, that is actually going to be breaking those aggregates open. And every time you do that, then you're destroying those aggregates. And you're also probably killing off some of the fungi that are there as well that are really key to building these aggregates back. So that's that other one of those other soil health principles that we're really talking about, is that disturbance, you know, minimizing that as much as possible. And then just to throw the fourth one back in again, you know, one of the keys with the soil cover is also protecting those aggregates just on the soil surface. Just having raindrops hitting that can break some of those aggregates open as well and disturb those. So you want to minimize that, and that can really help protect the soil from compaction, which gives you all these other benefits because it allows that water to soak in. It allows a better environment for your microbial community, providing you some of those other benefits on top of that.
Well, you made me feel so much better when we were meeting, when you talked about the fact that if we were following these soil practices, it would tend to minimize the compaction. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say any more about that, but it really made me feel better.
I mean, if you're following these principles, it really helps, you know, it can kind of fix the compaction. It can take a little bit of time for that to come back. You know, we see that in crop fields where, you know, on a large scale there, but it can take a couple years to build that soil structure up in those. With smaller spaces that you have in your yard and your garden, you have the advantage of being able to assist it with things like compost and mulch, which really feeds those microbes and really stimulates their activity. So that's a great option on that you can do. But all of those that can really help fix the problem, but also prevent it in the future.
That's when I felt better. Gary, this seems a perfect place to transition to the idea of doing what nature does. Some people are calling it going circular. Talk to us about this different way of thinking about leaves and trimmings, mulching and composting, reusable resources instead of yard waste.
Well, again, it's observing how nature does it. Nature has been at practice for a long time and has built these systems that seem to really work. They're quite sustainable, opposed to how we go about doing things. So you just take a tree, for instance. Deciduous trees have their leaves and they provide a function for the time of year when there's the most sunlight, and then they conserve energy that was made and they drop the leaves. And those leaves are food for something else. They're more than food though. They insulate the soil around the roots from being too hot and too cold. They conserve moisture that's under there. They allow for airflow, and they create this neighborhood that's great for all these microorganisms. And in addition, contribute the nutrients in there to fertility of the soil and the organic matter to build it up and help with those aggregates. If you go into a forest, you can dig with your fingers because it's so fluffy. And, you know, we see all these people in their yards with leaf blowers and leaf rakes and making it as tidy as possible. And it's the opposite of what really the soil needs. And it does not inhibit things coming up. I was just showing some children a mayapple coming up through a dried leaf. That dried leaf was so delicate, you could barely touch it without it breaking apart. And the mayapple was driving right up through that. And in my native area now, I put extra leaves on there. All the stalks are on there. Nobody's having a hard time coming out there at all. And, you know, this goes along a little bit like collecting grass clippings. like that, we take away so much moisture. We invest in the yard, we water it, we fertilize it, and then taking a third of those clippings away all the time just is bad nature economics that are there. And it's cultural. We see other people do it and we think we should do it. I encourage everybody to experiment and try. Having a corner of your yard where you put a bunch of leaves and see what happens. Even on your turf, put it there and see what happens. And so compost, we oftentimes think about it as taking something apart. It actually is composing something. So you're composing soil. That's how it happens in the natural environment. Even if you're the trunk of a tree, might take 40 years, but all the fungi and organisms are turning that into soil, and that's part of the system. So when we collect our food scraps, we're decomposing those materials, but we're composing them into soil. And there's plenty of resources out there to read. If you just go to the EPA site, you could spend a weekend reading all the materials on composting and the science behind it. And it's a fun hobby, and it's easy to just try and do it right. It's like cooking. You're putting ingredients together in different combinations, and you're getting a product. And basically we're eating soil when we eat our food.
Well, and there, you can strive to do perfect composting like you were talking about, or you can make a pile and leave it.
And it doesn't have to be elaborate. Like, it can be anywhere. The one thing I think that needs to be important to manage is if you're worried about critters being attracted to your yard. Like, if you have food scraps out there, you're going to have skunks and raccoons as friends, but depending where I've lived, I welcome that. I don't mind sharing my food scraps with something else. And I don't see them as a threat, but you can pile it up. You don't need a fancy compost bin. You can take a 30-gallon garbage can and cut the bottom out and dig a hole and put it in there, because you want the interaction of the organisms in the soil to enter into that, to help you with that. But I made a video of just food composting in my bin in the backyard, and it's like magic. I'm doing no active management and I never have to empty it. It just keeps getting absorbed into the ground, but it's great soil if you want to use it too and amend it. You have to take the stickers off the vegetables and be careful what you put in there. But I remember my grandfather, he didn't have garbage service. He buried everything in the backyard. And when we'd be gardening, there would be rusty cans that had decomposed back there, but he had beautiful soil.
Wow. Gary, were you the person that told me you go around to other people's leaf piles in the street and take theirs too? Somebody told me that.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
They're great even as insulation throughout the whole winter. It just, it amazed me. I just drift off a minute with this concept, but you can see it when we make a residential subdivision. They come in and they scrape the soil, the fertile soil off, and they make a spoil pile. And Stacy, maybe correct me on this, but they're damaging the soil by making it this huge pile that smashes all the soil down, takes the air out, eliminates the organisms. They build the houses, they don't put it back. They take it somewhere and you buy it back as a bag of soil or strips of sod. It's just.
Well, and I was thinking too, Gary, when you were talking about all the value in leaves collecting and all the little critters that overwinter in our leaves, and larvae that hatch out in the spring and become butterflies, and the fireflies that are in our leaf litter, we forget about that whole
Yeah.
world of living things.
We are really compassionate to wildlife, and we would just shudder if we saw people killing baby mammals, right? Or birds or fish kill makes us crazy. But if we could only hear all the screaming larvae and eggs and little insects that are in those leaves when we're raking them up and jamming them in a bag and sending them off somewhere, and they have a job. Everything in nature has a function, and so often we don't give them a chance. We send them on. I'm sorry if I'm talking doom and gloom, but it's just we're ignorant because we don't know any better. We're just following what we see other people do often.
We do have a question here that I noticed, someone asking how you keep your leaves from blowing away if you pile them on your garden like that.
Well, I would say stockpile them, and when they're blowing away, you're gifting somebody else. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
It's kind of an exchange. You're going to get somebody else's, and
Yeah, if they're wet, they don't blow away.
well, and here's someone else saying plant native grasses. The leaves get caught in them and hang around too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So did anybody else have something that you wanted to add to this part of the discussion?
Well, I'll add about mulch.
Oh, yeah.
That's another kind of crazy thing. We get rid of all these things that naturally are mulch, and then we purchase wood chips and painted wood chips. I learned that different color wood chips are popular in different parts of the country. It's cultural, but please, not rocks, because rocks are part of the system, but when they're piled up on top of sensitive roots, they can cut into that.
So there's a couple questions about mulching leaves. Is mulching leaves beneficial? And there was another question to ask separate of that I think would be pertinent right now.
And what, can you say it again?
Well, there's a question about, is mulching leaves beneficial?
Well, yeah, I just go over what I shared, and maybe it wasn't understood as mulch. Mulch is just, I think the definition is material around the base of a plant, and it has natural function. It keeps water from evaporating. It insulates against too cold and too hot. It adds nutrients. It adds fertility. It adds organic matter, and it encourages airflow. And decomposition generally takes place in an aerobic environment, so it needs that fluffy airflow that's in there, much like the problem of compacted soil. So think of leaves as a mulch material.
I just like to say, when you mulch leaves, what you're doing is you're creating more surface area for bacteria and fungi to break that leaf down. So it helps the decomposition process go a lot quicker.
Yep, I have a analogy that I shared with students on why maybe you want to shred up leaves when you're putting them down, and it's what Corey's talking about, surface area. If you brought a pizza to a classroom of children and just put it down and said, okay, everybody can have some pizza, it would be challenging to eat it because you would have to eat from the outside in. But if you cut it in pieces, everybody can enjoy it at the same time.
Now I'm hungry.
Well, and back to the mulching, to clarify that, if one is mulching leaves with a mower, are they not then destroying the little critters that we talked about?
Oh, yes. Yep, I would say so. And I can share that it's not necessary to chop them up. Oak leaves are usually slow in breaking down and decomposing. And I lived on a property with a lot of oak trees, and I blew them around the trees, and I made piles that started out maybe 5 feet tall in the fall. And after 3 years, it was like powder at the bottom of it. And that's with no management whatsoever from a human.
The one thing we do want to caution is that if you have a big bunch of really wet leaves, you don't want to put a pile of, they're kind of compacted together. There's no room for oxygen in there. You don't want to put something like that around your plants. But short of that, does anybody else want to say anything about the leaves or the wetness? Okay, well,
would-
Corey, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was just gonna add, one of the things with whether you're chopping it up or you're leaving it intact, and even whether it's leaves or using a different type of mulch out there, part of that, the benefit that you're getting on that for different times of the year is some of that insulation aspect that Gary talked about. And so you really have to think about how long you want that to last. So if you have, one of the goals with improving soil health is making a better environment and habitat for organisms. And that includes things like earthworms and beetles, who are going to be the ones who are actually breaking down those, there's fungus in there as well, but those are the ones that are really going to be breaking down those leaves naturally, and they're going to be bringing them down into the soil. So, if you're starting out from a degraded soil that doesn't have a lot of that, it's going to naturally take more time. So breaking them into smaller pieces might not be the worst idea to start out. But as you build that, you're not going to need to do that, because you're going to have the organisms there that are going to do that for you. Like naturally building that up. It can take some time, but it will happen. And then you don't need to do that kind of thing.
And easier is better generally, right? So, Corey, we want to come back to you to talk about how to get an area ready for planting native plants, particularly how to do it, as I said, easily with smothering, and when's smothering appropriate.
Okay, smothering is probably one of the easiest ways to deal with stuff when you don't want to disturb the soil. Basically, it involves removing as much as you can of the plants on top. Usually if an area is like infested with Canada thistle or something, I just worked on one of these areas not too long ago. And I basically burned it first. And then once that was all burned, I took off the stubs, as many as I could. I wanted to make sure a lot of the seed was burnt up. And then I put cardboard down, a layer of cardboard, something organic that's going to break down, corrugated cardboard. And then on top of that, this is something we do all the time. We put mulch down on top to hold it down. It maintains the moisture. And then what we do is then we wait. This is usually done in the fall, and then I'll plant in the spring. And what I do is I just drill a hole right where I want my plug to be, so I'm not tearing stuff up. However, squirrels like to dig through there, and deer like to come across and make holes in the cardboard and through the mulch, and you'll have stuff coming up. But if you do this method, it only takes like 2 inches of mulch on top. If you just want to use mulch, you're going to have to use a lot more mulch, to maybe 6 inches of mulch. And I think that's a lot of mulch to put on top. And I think Ken Williams was talking about some of this stuff before. It depends on what kind of invasive plants or deep-rooted plants that you have underneath there. Turf grass is really easy. A lot of times you can just use newspaper and then mulch. But with things like Canada thistle, that's why I leave it on for so many months to make sure it's not like I'm blocking the weeds from coming up. I'm doing that indirectly by keeping the sunlight from touching the plant. Now, there's still a lot of activity going. There's still worms under there. There's still a lot of organisms breaking down that whatever is left if I don't burn it. So when I do put my plant in, hopefully those mycorrhizal fungus will activate with the roots being put back in the ground, and they'll have that hopefully they'll still be around and establish those relationships. But the ground will be moist. The ground's still moist no matter how dry it is out when I plant the plants. So it's ready to go. And that's probably the easiest way to get ready when you really have a tough situation. You don't want to rip everything out by the roots. I must say though, garlic mustard I will take out, because garlic mustard will, because of the family it's in, will not allow mycorrhizal fungus to come into the area. It's kind of like drives it away. So if I take that out, then the mycorrhizal fungus can come in and establish relationships with the other plants. And if you're going to remove something, eventually you're going to have to put something back in that you want, or nature will decide to put something there, usually something you don't want, like an invasive plant, which are surprisingly very successful here.
And Stacy, since your day job is in the agricultural sector, would you talk about the kinds of farming ideas homeowners might be interested in? I'm thinking about the concept of cover crops to keep roots in the ground and how that might be adapted to small gardens, and also about when soil testing might be appropriate for the home gardener. I noticed there is even a question in the Q&A about soil testing.
Yeah, so I'll start with talking about cover crops. Cover crops are probably one of those practices I know in agriculture and our cropland across the state. I'm working on convincing farmers that that's a really good idea for them to do. It's a little bit of a risk for them sometimes to do, so that's and a cost to it for those farmers, but for the home gardener, it can be a really great option to get those continuous living roots out there, to bring in more biodiversity into that, especially if you're talking like a home vegetable garden or something like that, or anywhere that you have more of annual plants that are not going to be surviving over the winter. So generally, anytime you are removing plants or you have bare ground, we want to keep a living plant on there as much of the year as possible, whether that's in your home garden or that's in a farm field. So cover crops are really an option for that. And you can put, you can do mixes of them. It doesn't have to be just a single species. It can be all these different ones. I've seen some really great mixes that have everything from buckthorn and sun hemp and cowpea and sunflowers, which are really amazing to look at. Those kind of things if you're doing something that's over the summer, depending on what kind of when your timing is. But most of the time, probably you're going to be looking for cover crops that are in the fall, over the winter, and maybe even into the spring. And so things that get used for that are things like clovers and cereal rye and that kind of thing. All of that is, a possibility for there to grow, so that you have that growing in the fall and putting those continuous living roots as much of the time. So with those, one of the keys that you have to think about, though, for whether it's your home garden or on a larger scale, is how are you going to terminate it? Because generally, as a cover crop, it's just in between. It's something that you're putting in between things that you really want to be growing out there just to keep those living roots. So generally, you need to have a plan for what you're going to do for planting, your vegetable garden in the spring. How are you going to get that cover crop killed so that you can do that? So there's options out there for different cover crops if you plant them in the fall, that they grow in the fall, but then they winter kill. So they would get killed by the frost and then not be growing in the spring. So you don't have to worry about that. And that can provide right there a great mulch. You have all the roots that are in there that are helping, as well as the above ground plant residues that can really help as a mulch, which is a perfect option. A lot of the cover crop the downside of that is you don't get as much biomass growth in the spring because you only get what you can get in the fall, which again, it's a little different in your home gardens because you can maybe plant that a little earlier depending on what you're doing, but you might have some, you know, some different vegetables that are growing later into the fall, and you don't want to plant that until after you've got that vegetable off of there. So in those cases, something that lives through the spring might be better, but you need to have a plan for how you're going to kill that. So there's things like rollers and roller crimper. You can even do like homemade things. I've seen stuff on the internet where you can look up how you can just use like a stick and push it down, but you have to make sure you're actually breaking the stalk a little bit to actually kill it. But there's options like that there's different, you know, you can always use chemicals. I know, you know, we want to minimize our use of those if possible, but that is an option and might be a way to do that where you're just killing the plant. That's not really going to affect the soil underneath, because now you have the protection of that plant, the roots and the above ground residue, again, acting as that mulch, and that can give you even more of that carbon and biomass there from the living plant that's had a lot more time to grow. So there are a lot of options out there. It doesn't have to necessarily be like a typical cover crop, but I will say, if you're interested in cover crops, I know the Midwest Cover Crop Council is a really great resource. They have a selector tool that's available right now for row crop. They do have a vegetable one as well. It's not currently available. I think they're working on it right now, but that might be a great resource for you if you want to find out more information. I can share the link in the chat.
Okay.
I will do that here in just a second, but that might be a really great resource to find out kind of what are available cover crops out there that might work for you. Because the key with picking a cover crop is not just, you want one that's going to give you a certain benefit, whatever you're looking for. Maybe it's just having something living. Maybe it's to prevent erosion, to fix nitrogen, to, you know, provide, you know, alleviate compaction. Those are some of the benefits they can get. There's different types of cover crops are going to work better for that than others. You know, there's a lot of relatively native species, maybe not exactly here, but very close, that are not as widely used, but that can also be used by that as a cover crop with that. One of the keys, again, is coming back and making sure that you know how to, if it's going to terminate on its own, or if you're going to have to kill it and how you're going to do that. Because, you know, you don't want to have, worst case scenario, you go in and till it, but that's like, that should be your backup to your backup to your backup. You don't want to have to go in until that, because that kind of, you don't get all the benefits anymore. If that's your way of terminating, that is an option, but probably not the best if you're trying to get all those soil health benefits.
So there was a question about clover as a cover crop. And will that coexist with vegetables if it's a vegetable garden, or in our case, native plant gardens?
So I'm not entirely sure on if there'd be any problem with it. I mean, I think it's just certain types of clovers are not going to grow as well through the summer. But generally, I don't think there'd be a problem with that, that I'm aware of anyway.
Okay,
I've heard that white clover is okay.
white clover.
That's what I've heard.
So this Midwest Council, or Midwest Cover Crop Council, would probably be a source for us to ask those questions then.
They do have quite a few resources. Again, it's geared more towards, you know, crop fields, but it's the same information that can be applied in your home gardens and smaller areas as well. It's the same ideas behind it. They would have a lot of information about some of the cover crops that have been used on the larger scale things, and it's totally adaptable then to your smaller scale operations. I think it's just really important to have something green out there as much of the year as possible. And cover crops really can provide that, especially, you know, in, you know, a vegetable garden or something like that. I have a farmer that I worked with before who he does cover crops on his fields, his large scale fields, but he didn't until relatively recently start putting those in on his home garden, and it made a big difference there, but he didn't even think about how important that could be there. It's the
Yeah.
same idea. We just need to get, you don't want to see that brown any more than you can, because we want to protect it. We want to keep it in place. And it's underneath there. We want it to be great for us. It's going to be better if we're keeping something green on it as much of the year as possible.
You know, before you go on to soil testing, we do have a question, and I had the same question. Did you meant buckwheat, not buckthorn when you were
Yes,
talking?
buckwheat. Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
So now soil testing, because we're getting out of time, and we'll then open for questions that have.
So, I mean, with soil testing, generally, you know, from a nutrient perspective, it's not something probably most home gardens you're going to have to worry about, because your soil's pretty good. Usually, if you are removing a lot of plant material from that and moving it somewhere else, which is the opposite of what we've been talking about, you know, that's when you're going to have nutrient problems. Obviously, on soils that has had that topsoil removed, that is an issue, but you can kind of alleviate that with compost and things like that. And then you don't really need to worry about soil testing as much, because it's going to tell you the same thing. Just put that, you're going to need some compost to build that soil organic matter to bring those nutrients in. pH, however, might be something that you might need to check into, that you might need to use something to adjust. So that would possibly be something that you'd want to look into, is soil testing for the pH in particular. And generally, that comes in like the soil fertility testing. That's one of it. The organic matter is another component of that. And those are usually somewhere around the range of $7 to $10 from a commercial lab. I do know, and I know the question that came up was about, you know, U of I extension doesn't do that anymore. There are some close by land grant universities that do still do testing that you can send it to if you don't want to send it to a commercial lab. I know Wisconsin and Missouri both have soil testing labs that you can send them to. I think the University of Illinois Extension has a page on their website that lists a lot of options that are out there. So I think that would be a great resource to look at for where to start on finding a soil testing laboratory.
We found that the U of I extension was where you can place your question and they'll direct you then. In our case, it was to the Farm Bureau, but they direct you then to the right place for the right test. So there's a number of questions, and I know our time is running out. So maybe if we're ready, we could go to some of the questions. What do you think, Nancy?
Yeah, we are definitely ready for questions. I've been looking through, and I think a lot of them have been answered. Here's one though. If the prior homeowner sprayed Roundup for 20 years and you're also near a busy street, do you recommend a soil test in that situation? Anybody?
Well,
I don't know that I would not necessarily say that that's anything that would be worrying that you'd need a soil test for. I don't think.
the half-life on Roundup.
Potentially, if you have, you know, if you had salt, I guess from that would be your issue if that's getting on there. But generally, I don't know that that'd be getting up on your lawn if there's a curb. It just depends on your situation there. So if it's near that, or you see issues near the road from that, you know, that might be worth testing especially for the pH. But I don't think there's nothing about Roundup that I would necessarily say that you need to do a soil test for. That's not really going to impact any of the characteristics. It breaks down really rapidly. It's a much safer chemical. I know it has a bad rap, but it's really actually one of the safer herbicides that we have. It does kill most plants. So it's obviously you have to follow instructions and be very careful using it because of the plants. But from the rest of the perspective, it's not really having a long-term impact on the organisms in the soil. at least not on any of the literature that I've read.
And here's one, can cover crops be useful in raised beds?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead,
no,
right.
Stacy.
Go
Go for it, Corey.
Well, I just know that, the mycorrhizal fungus, that helps make the aggregates and feeds things will be there the whole time. So yeah, it helps the soil stay living. It keeps feeding the soil, and that's what we want, is we want the soil to keep being fed, and that's actually taking care of the soil. Yeah, and another thing about using chemicals, no matter what it is, know what it does and know how to use it, because it's a lot of responsibility to use a chemical in nature, because it's not, you have to really respect the chemical, and you have to respect the nature, and you have to know how it works. So, if we don't do that, we're gonna have real problems, and we're gonna end up hurting what it is we're trying to save.
I see another question here. I have a vegetable garden in the spring. I remove the soil to put around my trees. I start with new soil each spring. Should I keep the old soil and just mix a little new? My hunch is that means the new soil comes with nutrients in it. And that's maybe Darlene, I'm thinking maybe that's your way of putting nutrients in the soil where the vegetables have removed them the year before.
Put leaves on it.
My response would be add compost instead of removing the soil or adding new soil.
Right, just build it.
Because you can't, that soil structure, those soil aggregates, anytime you're removing that and moving that around, you're losing a lot of that. So it needs to stay in place. You can add to it by adding compost. That's the food and the organic matter that really can jumpstart that. But anytime you're moving that around, you're going to lose some of it. And that's one of the biggest benefits of building the soil health is those aggregates.
Yep, I made a comment before about the difference between soil and dirt. And oftentimes when you're buying a bag of soil, you're actually buying a bag of dirt because it's not full of life.
I think Kim here is asking Corey to elaborate a bit on the chemical you mentioned that starts with
Trichlor.
Oh, triclophir. Triclophir is it mimics a growth hormone in plants that causes uncontrolled growth in the roots, and usually that's enough to kill the plant. And I don't spray it on. I have a brush, and usually it's if I'm cutting a shrub or a buckthorn or tree of heaven, I'll put that on the bloody stump. Or if I don't have time, I will scrape the bark off the tree. I will put it on the tree and wait for the tree to die. That way it doesn't produce any berries or fruit that the birds can get and carry off and redistribute. And then in the fall, I'll take the whole thing down, or in the winter.
Well, it was Kim's question, and she's asking, she said, in the forest preserve, it's part of Garland 4, which we cannot use at higher temperatures. Is that what he is talking about?
Isn't Garland 4 like around to be used around water? I thought that's what they use around water. That I don't know. I've had success, and I just use this. It's just a stump and vine killer is what it is. And I think it's only 6 or 8% triclophir. And it has a little brush, and I just paint it on. And I only use it on woodies.
Okay.
Annette says, I'm struggling with how to lessen the impact on soil while removing invasives. And I know we've talked some among ourselves about the move toward not pulling out weeds, but rather cutting them off. She says, do you recommend pulling out white avens and creeping Charlie by hand? Do you remove daylilies with a shovel? Do you remove bishop's weed or gout weed by using your fingers and getting under the rhizomes? Lastly, how do you remove lilies of the valley?
Oh, boy.
You move, you
You
move.
move, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think it was Ken that talked about the lily of the valleys, how he tried smothering them and everything. And he tried solarizing them with plastic for a year and took the plastic off, and they were happy to see him. So I don't know, that might take a little bit more of an aggressive approach. Maybe get a goat and let it go to town.
I
You know,
think all the above.
Yeah, all the above, but the goat first and then poison later, not poison and then goat, because you might not have a goat.
For you, Stacy, is your sense that restorative agriculture is becoming more common in Illinois?
So I'd say it's definitely, there's a lot more interest in it. There's a lot more conversation about it. Regenerative, sustainable, soil health management, all of these terms, they're much more widely used. There's a lot of people who are really receptive to it. It's still a risk for a lot of farmers to do because it takes time to see the benefits on their soil from that, and it costs money and it may impact their yields. So it's not necessarily a guarantee for them. So it's a little tricky to get them on board with it. Another complication that we have in Illinois from a cropland perspective is over central and northern Illinois, we have some of the best soils in the world. High organic matter, prairie soils, they are amazing. But that also means that we can't, a lot of the conversation about soil health and sustainability and things like that has been in the last decade or so, really focused on building organic matter. And on those soils, they already have a lot of organic matter. So there's not as much interest in it. So one of my jobs has been for the last couple of years, really kind of changing that focus on some of the other benefits, and especially things to do with aggregate stability and building up that soil structure, because those are benefits that they can really gain by focusing on regenerative agriculture, sustainability, that they aren't necessarily going to see if they continue with conventional systems.
And I just want to point out for Tanya that I have put the plant sale date and place, Gray Willows Farm. I forgot to put in the time, 9 to 2, but that's in the chat now.
So I'm thinking we either take one more question. Our time is getting away from us, and we want to honor our panelists and their time, the time they've given us today. So Nancy, if you see one more question there.
Joanne Schindler is asking about how to get rid of creeping bellflower, which is taking over. Corey, can I throw that one to you?
Well, is it just by itself? Or is it mixed in with other plants? If it's by itself, some of these things I'll just burn. I'll burn them out. Just take the torch and burn them. It's fun.
And if they're not by themselves.
If they're not, then it takes a more surgical approach to it. And that's one that, you can clip it, you can cut it like we were talking about before. And if you go with the cutting routine, what we're trying to do is exhaust the starch in the root. Just exhaust the starch in the root. And you might have to keep going at it, but you know what? That's gardening. It's a labor of love. And the more time you spend in your garden, whether you're taking out weeds, you're getting more acquainted to what's down there and have a better appreciation for all the things you have growing and see all the life that's in there. There's a lot of things in the soil, in the plants you're growing, and the flowers. I mean, it's really a whole world by itself.
Well, thank you all panelists for your time and energy that you put into having the program tonight and being the perfect cap on our series of 4 sessions about soil and its importance. Thank you to the Elgin Sustainability Commission for partnering with us with the Gail Borden Library. And thank you all for attending. If you haven't already gotten your handout, look for tomorrow's follow-up email, and happy gardening.